Promptly.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I am Carolyn Desan, the Associate Dean of the CGA, and I'm really quite delighted that we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of the MS and Global Security, Conflict, and Cybercrime. Thank you all so much for coming out and marking 5 years. It's actually been a little 5+ years. So we did in the fall, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the CGA, and now to be recognizing the really incredible growth of the cyber program. And so I just want to sort of share very briefly a little bit of the history behind it, because I was kind of fortunate to be a part of it, is very much kind of coming from students and sort of seeing where types of positions that were coming available and what students were looking for in the classroom. And, we had an opportunity to sit down and sort of think about launching a new master's program. And this would have been, I guess, 2015, where we started to put together a proposal for an MS in cyber. And at that time, the plan was not to have such a long title, because I know that still remains a little bit of a mouthful for a lot of students, and not just for students. But it was actually because part of it was sort of kind of what was happening at the university. So we sort of had to pivot a little bit, and we came out with the Global Security, Conflict, and Cybercrime, which is, of course, inclusive of a lot of different things. And we launched officially in 2019, and it's grown quite significantly. And we have, many more students than what we anticipated we'd have when we first launched. Really grateful to the leadership of Dr. Chris Ankersen, who serves as the faculty lead and academic director for the cyber program. And we welcomed our second full-time faculty member in the program, Dr. Danny Steed, who just joined us in January. A very warm welcome, Danny. We're really delighted to have you here. And so to all of you who are online, thank you so very much for joining us. To our special guests who will be speaking tonight, thank you very much. Adam, I am a big fan. I have been in the audience at the Council on Foreign Relations and have heard you speak and follow your work. So thank you very much for joining us. So I'm going to stop here, but just say, it's, onwards and upwards in terms of the way that I see the cyber program, and I'm really just grateful for everyone's participation and helping to make it the program that it is. And enjoy a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. I would echo what Dr. Cassana said and say thank you very much for coming. Welcome to this 5th anniversary event. In addition to the people that Carolyn has thanked, I'd like to thank her for her kind of steadfast support all the way through, from conception to the hiring process to very much being an advocate for the program, both inside the CGA, when in the beginning it needed that, like a plant growing in a forest, it needed a little protection and sunlight and water to make sure that it got where it has been, but also externally looking at other kinds of stakeholders, both in SPS, but also the wider NYU and the wider world communities. He's not here tonight, but we have to thank very much Dr. Pano Yannakogeorgis, who was the initial kind of hire into the space, who really, with a left and right of arc, some broad parameters, really built a program from scratch in a very short amount of time and had it ready for launch. I think he was given, 2 months to kind of get it from hiring to the first students coming in the door. First class was about 7 students the first year, very much a bespoke artisanal event. And now by the time we're into the 5th year now, we're coming to kind of a semi-industrial level of production where we've got 65 students in the latest cohort. So it really has been every semester it's more and more and more students. So it's very interesting to see. But I think not only the growth of the program, the changing of the landscape of what it means to talk about cybersecurity. Even a short time ago, as 5 years ago, this was very much focused on a national security understanding of cybersecurity. How do you secure national networks, national infrastructure from either criminal or hostile kind of foreign actors. But I think as the idea of security has changed, cybersecurity has also changed with it to look at other issues that traditionally may not have been considered part of the cybersecurity realm, things like ethics. How do you act ethically within cyberspace? How do you protect things like identity, human rights, as well as stuff and things in cyberspace? So keeping up with that dynamic, I think, has been a challenge where we are looking for not only good ideas, but then making the bureaucratic processes as such as they are, turning those into reality. But now we have courses on the books that we certainly didn't even think of having 5 years ago, cyber ethics course, a cyber and gender course as being just two of those examples. And I think the future looks very much more in this way as the landscape of cybersecurity is changing again. If any of you have been keeping track of what's been going on in terms of the cyber arms race, as it were, very much again, kind of looking at this through the lens of a geopolitical competitive arena, but also the notion of public-private partnerships, shall we say, or certainly the drivers coming from private sector, the notions that regulation versus innovation, for example, are kinds of dynamics where cybersecurity needs to fit itself into that discussion as well. And again, if you're an optimist or a pessimist, you have a different view of what that might look like. I think people were very surprised, for example. I know we don't want to prejudice what's going to go on in the discussion, but things like the Paris Summit on AI was a real volte-face from what had happened just a year earlier in Seoul, for example. So the landscape within which cybersecurity is taking place is changing all the time. That's certainly not only due to the second Trump administration, but that certainly can't be left out of that discussion as well. In the last 5 years, we've produced a number of alums that have gone on to places like law enforcement, intelligence, government cyber agencies such as CISA and the NSA, but as well AI startups, some of which are kind of working on government contracts, some of which are much more pure play in the private sector, private firms, platforms, consultancies, as well as a few entrepreneurs who have gone on to do their own startup work. So I think something that perhaps sounds very much like a technical space really confronts very early on the notion that this is really about a cybersecurity in a global security or a global policy framework. So we're looking to produce and have done a very good job, I think, in the last 5 years of producing those people who can be translators, who can be tech whisperers to the policy folks and policy whisperers to the tech folks. Certainly something that we see, if you remember the Facebook or the TikTok kind of Senate hearings, the need for the ability to kind of be comfortable in both of these arenas doesn't go away. So as that landscape changes, the challenge, of course, is to make sure that we've got these able and nimble translators that are able to kind of work within that space. And that's certainly going to be the challenge for the next 5 years as we go. That's enough from me for now, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Danny Steed.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and good evening to the audience on the webcam. For everyone online, forgive me if I look like I'm breaking away. I've got carbon-based life forms in the room to engage with as well. So, but just to introduce a panelist between Chris and Adam, who are really going to take us through things this evening, where we've got just over half an hour for their reflections before opening up to Q&A. And first, for our esteemed guest, Adam Segal, who, as soon as Chris told me you were joining us, Adam, I was quite excited as well, echoing what Carolyn had said on her remarks. And for the sake of everyone in the audience, Adam is the Ira A. Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies, National Security, and Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, The Hacked World Order, Adam, I don't mind trying to spare your blushes. It's on every one of my reading lists for sure, and it has been for some time. I'm certainly a fan of that book, and I encourage any of our students who are on the call to make sure that you go and get it. It is essential reading on this. And then there's my new colleague, Chris Ankersen, who is clinical professor in global affairs here and the program director for our mouthful of a course on cyber, right, Carolyn? Because it's still only being a few weeks here, I keep getting the order wrong. But Masters in Global Security, Conflict and Cybercrime, which may be the first time I've got it completely correct, having thumbs up from Carolyn in the audience. So Chris, director of that, coming to us via, like myself, an import via Canada, the Canadian Army and the United Nations, which according to things should be an endangered species.
Both of them.
Even sketch on Saturday Night Live ejecting the Canadians. So maybe we're all endangered. So gentlemen, the proposition to try and pitch to you both, and Adam, that I know you're taking more of the contrarian view, so I'd like to start with your thoughts on this, but really this view of that the free and open internet is the surest route to prosperity and security. Did you want to open with your more contrarian view to take on that position?
Sure, and thank you for including me. It's an honor to be part of the anniversary, and congratulations to all of you for everything that you've built. So yeah, I think I will start from the kind of opening line of a task force that the council did 3 years ago, which is, essentially that the global internet is dead, and probably never really existed, and that that in some way may be good. We can deal with the reality that almost from the beginning, states exerted control over that. They did it for domestic stability and legitimacy reasons. They did it for national security reasons. They did it for cultural reasons. They did it for technology reasons. And while we should try to encourage as much flow of data between the like-minded, I think the expectation that we would have a global platform was, as we found out, quite naive. And so preparing ourselves and confronting that world is really what we need to be doing now. We have, we've seen through the way that foreign operators take advantage of US platforms for influence operations, that they take advantage of our openness. And we also see for more possibly destructive attacks through operations like Salt Typhoon or Volt Typhoon, also taking advantage of cloud providers, other open platforms, and that we probably should be thinking about more controlled, more tightly controlled systems for our own defense.
Adam, thank you. Chris, your opening remark on that?
Interestingly, I'm also going to start with a kind of quote from a document, an older document, and as Adam has said, perhaps a much more naive document, but I think it's worth taking the sentiment out there, which is to say, I ask you to leave us alone. And this is a sentence from John Perry Barlow's infamous, by now, 1996 Declaration of Independence on cyberspace. And I think that is really where we see the pushback to state, perhaps legitimate, perhaps overreaching desires for control, for surveillance, for a sense of safety or security that is difficult to define where the limits of that are. So, Barlow talked about cyberspace being a place where human beings can be left to be alone, to express themselves, to do all the manner of kind of human things that perhaps they have been prevented from doing in the real world, as it were, and to be able to have cyberspace as this virtual domain, a kind of a new frontier where anything was possible. And again, I'm not saying that wasn't a naive hope, but I think keeping that spirit, that there are limits to how much we should, I think, not only we need to respect perhaps state sovereignty, but there have to be an understanding that there has to be a limit to that. Otherwise, I think the opposite of that, an unfree and closed internet, is going to get us into a world of walled gardens, not only that are controlled by states, but that are very much owned and controlled by platforms, perhaps in the name, the justification of some kind of arms race, a new kind of geopolitical Cold War. But I think it's important to have that spirit of what a free and open internet looks like, so that it's not lost in this kind of race to close things down. And if we go back, and again, perhaps maybe equally as optimistic or naive would be the Obama administration's understanding of what this free and open internet looked like, hallmarked by net neutrality, open standards, transparency, free speech, and low barriers to entry. And I think those as principles shouldn't get lost in the race to erase that and enable overreach, not only by states, but also, as I said, by private firms now, who in many cases are even more powerful actors than the kind of giants of steel and flesh and steel that Barlow was worried about. I think what puts the internet, the free and open internet, in jeopardy, and thereby kind of all of us as citizens and users of the internet, are a couple of drivers. One is securitization, this notion that we have to be worried about doing X, otherwise the Chinese will get there first, or we have to worry about X, otherwise the bad actors will interfere with us. I think this notion of an arms race, of this securitization narrative, really does legitimate a closing down of the internet, which can mean that we're going to lose whatever value we have in having this tool in the name of securitization. The second driver, I think, is commodification, where there's been a drive for ownership and proprietary aspects of the internet, where you can't have this, you can't have it for free. It isn't open because it's mine. It's owned by not a open source consortium, but now by a firm of some sort, or maybe even an arm's length aspect of a state somewhere. I think beyond that, though, it even goes further into a concentration. There are fewer and fewer of these actors in this ecosystem. The large fish have essentially swallowed up many of the minnows, and that kind of leaves us much more in a monopoly position, where actually we have the illusion of choice much of the time. There isn't much differentiation between what is available in this marketplace of ideas, this marketplace of products. And the last driver, I think, that kind of maybe is the culmination of all of these, is a real sense of colonization within cyberspace, that ideas, platforms, networks, and even resources like rare earths, critical minerals, and the component parts of the internet, so not only submarine cables, but chips themselves, are also now coming under pressure to monopoly, to state ownership, to some kind of establishment of a dominant position, and even some form of almost cyber mercantilism, where it's really very much seen as a zero-sum game. So I think guardrails are a great idea, but we have to be very careful that those guardrails don't become guillotines, where things like obscenity laws in Indonesia or the Computer Crimes Act in Thailand are used on the basis of protecting citizens from the harms on the internet, but actually are used as tools of control, of surveillance by the state to kind of limit political resistance, for example, within those countries.
Adam, it's quite a list of concerns Chris has. Are those exactly the things you're talking about confronting from your opening? Is that what you meant by confronting not the naivety, but the reality of what you see in the global internet?
So I think I do share many of the same drivers as Chris does, of what is in many ways not only just fragmenting the, if I understand Chris correctly, not just cyberspace, but in the entire kind of tech world. His last point about colonization in the tech stack. I think, though, it may be helpful to step back and think what it is that we are trying to accomplish, and then, you know, that in some part depends upon what we're speaking of, right? Are we talking about, you know, the people that John Barlow was speaking about was the individual user, right? And somehow they're existing in some world where they can, you know, be free of some type of regulation in the outside state. Are we talking about businesses? Are we talking about nation states? And are we talking about our nation state, the United States, in this case for myself? And I think in each of those cases, the risks are different, and what we're willing to accept are different as well. What types of guardrails or other types of regulations or controls. From a US government perspective, I still think that the aim is it's very similar in that we still talk about a free, open, secure, and reliable internet cyberspace. But again, it is an expectation that all of those forces that Chris mentioned impinge on that, and that we have to defend, at least among those that share the same values, the ability to share the information and data as freely as possible, and that to ensure that individuals in the space are not surveilled, have a right to their data or to control their data, and are free from other types of harassment and other things. All of that requires, as Chris knows and will concede, some intervention of the state and regulation and coordination among state and private sector actors. So I think that the issue really is, again, as I said, kind of what is it we're trying to accomplish and what level we're talking about. What's the unit of analysis.
So Chris, what do you, if you're confronting the threat like Adam says, where do you focus? Because it's a big list, isn't it?
Well, it is a big list, and I think, as Adam correctly says, there are a number of referent objects that we can look at. Is it the individual person? Is it the state? Is it a startup that needs to have an equal playing field to compete with the tech giants? I mean, there's lots of aspects that are included in this notion of the free and open internet. And again, in the same way that you can be a libertarian and think anything goes and your ability to, free speech has no bounds, or you can be one that is a bit more, patriarchal or a vision of some kind of nanny state where you get to determine what's going on. I think picking the right level of the level of analysis is an impossibility, because of course it's all of these things simultaneously. They do have different thresholds, they have different standards of what's acceptable, but you can't say we're here to protect people and not the state and the critical infrastructure, for example, that enables democracy or enables service delivery of whatever it may be. But I think more broadly speaking, this is where the spirit of the free and open is important to keep in mind, because we have seen since the beginning of states being coming into being, they tend to be pretty rapacious in their desire for control, and left unchecked without these kinds of principles, perhaps, or naive ideals, as a reminder of what we're really trying to enable, and not just let the slippery slope of securitization take us down to limits about what you can do. I think we want to keep that in mind. So I don't want to sound like recent speakers in Munich, but I mean, are we willing to kind of engage with fighting the narratives that we don't like, or are we going to try to close down those conversations altogether? And there's an example, I think, of where we would like to have as much discourse and dialogue and conversation as possible, while at the same time making sure that there are safeguards for safety and integrity, as it were. But there have to be limits on the limits. And I think if we lose sight of what we're actually trying to keep in mind here, the argument of the slippery slope of securing the X has a kind of a logic of its own, where you end up with a very, very limited amount of space, a limited number of providers, limited about what you can do in terms of intellectual property infringement, all in the name of securing a monopoly or securing an advantage for established players, whether those players are public players or private players.
So Adam, one of the things I'd like to press you on, just for a bit of specificity, where at your opening you had said the global internet is dead, and this concern of a naivety of what that list, we call it that 1990s view of what the internet was seen to be. Are you saying that vision of the internet did exist, that Barlow-esque position, and that it's now effectively being strangled by stronger forces in the 25, 30 years since? Or are you saying it was a hopeless naivety in the first place and it's never really existed? It was a projection, a fantasy, if you will, politically, and we've never. I'm wondering if you were saying that we've never truly confronted the reality of what the internet ever was in truth. I wonder if you could go into that a little bit.
I think it's a little of both, quite honestly. I think there was a naive expectation that, well, on the one hand, that everyone would see the benefits of openness. You remember that Secretary Clinton gave a number of speeches where essentially the argument was, if you weren't on this side of openness, you were on the wrong side of history. And that, of course, it was in your benefit. I remember being at many, many meetings with the tech companies where, they, were looking to academics and the think tank world to argue, especially for countries like China and others, to say, look, if you're not open, you're going to miss out on the internet revolution. You're going to be cut off from the economic benefits. And you're going to slow your own innovation and economy down. And so I think there was an assumption that everyone would be convinced of the wiseness of that view. And from the beginning, lots of countries were not convinced of that. And I think the naivete came from the sense that they would be swayed by that. And so that assumption, I think, was turned on its head. In part where we began to think, oh, actually, no, the states that control it have advantages that the democracies and the like-minded don't have. And so now we're confronted with vulnerabilities in our systems that we see the other sides exploiting and taking advantage of. So I think it was both a naivete about the vision and a naivete about how the world was going to move and actually existed as we went forward.
Grace, do you agree with that? Do you think it ever was there, this free and open internet, or was it just a hopeless naivety, like you say, a Barlow-esque dream?
Well, I mean, I think, it's easy to get metaphorical about the 1990s, representing that across almost every domain that was talked about, right? This was the end of history. This was a unipolar moment. And the idea that like-mindedness was going to then become universal, that yes, within the like-mindedness, which would eventually encompass 99% of the earth, then you could have nice things, you could have these conversations because that wouldn't be exploited or taken advantage of. And you can name the day that all ended. But I guess the idea is that if we want to go back to an earlier era, if we're not careful without keeping some of that naivete or idealism alive, it's easy to slip into some kind of digital McCarthyism, where if you're advocating for anything that is free and open, somehow you're ceding the ground to bad actors, that you're obviously in cahoots or sympathetic with, China or Russian hackers or, criminals on the internet. And I think we have to be careful. We have to be careful to resist, let's call it the cynical view, which is that everything everywhere is now somehow vulnerable to the point of really restricting what's going on. Because again, I think there's an easy way that becomes abused, not only by states, but also by established actors that are saying, well, copyright law or patents or some other form of proprietary, code or algorithmic proprietariness, it can be used as a bludgeon or a way of erecting large barriers of entry on the basis of we don't want bad people to exploit it. But what it actually is cementing and putting a moat around those actors that are already here and established. So I think, yes, we have to avoid the 100% cynical or naive view, but that doesn't mean that we should shift the pendulum too far. Because again, I think the notion of like-mindedness, and it's fine within a polite company, it's very difficult to avoid that becoming an echo chamber where we're not even willing to engage with other people. We don't even know what the other people are saying because we're assuming everyone's a spy or a criminal. It's a very difficult world to have any kind of openness.
And Adam, we're veering to geopolitics now, right? Very clearly, because if the key check against our naivety has been that geopolitical awakening, and if we start accepting cyber as the always reflects, if not it being a complete mirror of our geopolitics in play, right? Is this all just a reflection of that wider geopolitics of the last 30 years, that it just happened to arrive at a time of immediate post-World War, end of history, liberal democratic optimism that has been slowly checked very hard over a couple of decades, and that cyber simply reflects the broader geopolitics of what we're talking about here? Do you think there are any legs to that idea?
I mean, I do, since that was kind of the fundamental argument of the book I wrote, which is that all of it was being structured by geopolitics. And I think you're right. I mean, the global internet, as it grew out of the 90s, grew out of that unipolar moment. It grew out of it. The fact that it was American technology companies that were globalizing these globalizing the technology, becoming the platforms for the rest of the world. They brought with them their understanding about how these technologies should be governed and regulated. And ever since then, we've seen the pushback. We've seen it both from states who want more control, and now we increasingly see it, the fact that the U.S. firms are not the only global platforms any longer. Between Huawei and ByteDance and all the other Chinese firms that now have global users as well, that we have seen that pushback there, and they in many cases reflect the domestic political environments they grew out of, and they are spreading some of those ideas and views, and that's why we're having a debate about which platforms Americans and others should go onto, and who they should share their data with, and who should have access to that data.
I would say to that there's another way of kind of telling that story, right? And if you look at the work, for example, of people like Henry Farrell and the notion of the underground empire, where he says, okay, the free and openness was used as a tool by the United States predominantly, but others as well, to establish the rules of the game and in a kind of a permissive environment for the build out of a thing, whether we're talking about transatlantic, telegraph cables, but eventually the internet. And now we come to a point where there's a retrenchment going on, and now the ladder is being lifted up, and now the rules are being changed to say no more free and open, because we've already reached the point where we are as comfortable or as established as we want to, and therefore, there is no more free and open because we don't need it to be free and open anymore. And I think that telling, well, there's ways of exaggerating that, echoes perhaps other patterns of development throughout history. Again, the mercantilist colonization metaphor, where this is yet another example of gaining the high ground and then changing the rules. And what does that mean for us as we go forward when places like, for example, it's now that TikTok is popular, now that TikTok has market share, that it becomes a threat. Now that DeepSeek, for example, has kind of come out onto the marketplace, now it's seen as something that needs to be protected. OpenAI was fine with competition until there was a competitor. And now, of course, there is no room for free and openness. So I wonder if there isn't another way of telling that story, which isn't really about now we're under attack, more to the point, now we have something to defend and we need to kind of pull up the drawbridge, circle the wagons, and end those aspects of competition that would be enabled by a more free and more open ecosystem.
Adam, any view on that it's actually more about self-protection than anything else?
I don't know, because when I read the Farrell and the Underground Empire, the way I read it is from the beginning, these network systems had nodes of control, right? So they tell the story of the financial system, they told the story about chips, and they tell the story about internet, right? And each of those have nodes of control, which the United States had power over. And then as geopolitical competition stepped up, the United States used those nodes to choke its adversaries off from information, technology, or money. And I think, the Chinese looked at that and very much thought, oh, we want something similar, right? We want to wire the world to us. And, that's in part what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. That's in part what the Digital Silk Road is about. And that's, as I agree with Chris, is that once the United States realized it was vulnerable to those type of choke points, then it began to, try to weaken China, right? So it saw that Huawei was building out 5G or 4G and 3G in most of the emerging economies, and was worried both about what that flow of data meant and the ability to leverage that and exert pressure. And tried to fight back for those nodes. But I have the same, I see the same metaphor, but I see it as not as openness, but as from the beginning, there were these nodes of control that now both sides are fighting over, if we're going to use that framing.
So we've got a few minutes before going to trying to open up to Q&A. So I want to casually throw in the grenade of AI. And start trying to probe what sort of disruptors or disruptions do we begin to think AI could have on this idea of a free and open internet, or Adam, even the converse of could it further kill what was never there in the first place? I'm just wondering how we start to tackle this entire science, which is now very much coming online.
I mean, so my unsatisfying answer right now is it's too soon to say, but I would say, look, for AI, for cybersecurity, the balance between offense and defense, I don't think we know yet. Clearly, lots of worries about that it's going to make offense easier. Most of the studies so far don't seem to show that. It seems to show that it's benefited defense more, but I suspect that that's going to change. The question about openness and closed, right? We, lots of lawsuits about OpenAI and how they train their systems, and they took advantage of the open internet to do it. So that question about how open those systems will be for moving forward for AI and development, I think, are still being questioned. DeepSeek and the breakthrough there, open source, open weight model versus, the story we had been telling ourselves, at least in the US, that we had a pretty big moat because of OpenAI and proprietary systems. Going to be less chip reliant, less energy reliant. So, going to diffuse in lots of different ways. My sense is that there's a lot of focus on AI as, to use the Chinese term, an assassin's mace, or a kind of a weapons platform that is going to dramatically change. Whoever gets it first is going to have this, the atomic bomb before everyone else does. So that would be kind of the more closed model. I tend towards the more diffusion Jeff Ding argument that in fact it's going to be less, who makes that breakthrough, and more how it's diffused into the economy and used more broadly.
And here I think I would agree with Adam's telling of the feral narrative, which is we're probably going to see the same patterns that we've seen in the development of every other technological tool, whether it's been railroad, telegraph, the internet, the same kinds of trajectories, first mover advantage, the idea that you try to move fast to gain some kind of vital ground and then essentially retrench, except that it'll happen at a faster pace. So I don't see again, you can see the glass is half full or glass is half empty, but I think however you see that, we're likely to see AI following that same kind of trope with the same kinds of debates, but it's going to happen much more quickly.
Okay. I think at this point, gents, it's good to open up to Q&A broadly. So for any of you online in the audience, if Emily, am I right? You're going to help me triage because I can't quite see anyone. Please do either raise hand or get them typed into the chat channel. Just while you do, I want to see if anyone in our physical audience has one, please.
I can go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Chris. Fascinating. I'm a beginner in this area. Chris, what was the day it all ended? You said we all know what day it all ended, the idea of the like-minded internet and kind of the idea that it was a safe space. So I'm super interested in that. So I have more than one question.
Go ahead.
If I can go ahead. Adam, I think I would direct this to you. My name's Anne-Marie Goetz, by the way. I'm a faculty member here at the Center for Global Affairs. My question is, like, you both have been kind of vague about any sort of regulatory system that might be useful. And Adam looks frozen now, so I don't know if he's still there. If you can hear me.
I think he's there, yeah.
Okay, good. But like, what kinds of regulation or what kind of control is actually constructive? I'm of course quite interested in the way there are so many horrific biases built into so much of the technology that we rely on in the kind of cyber world, gender biases, racial biases, et cetera. And it just seems like so much seems to sort of, when you have a permissive environment, everything slides into a really swampy mess. And so like, what systems could work to make it less swampy?
Is that for both of us? or-
Yeah, sure, but, and for you, it's like.
Yeah, so
when did it end?
I don't think I said we all know the date, and then I think it's when we don't know the date ended, but you can kind of choose your day. And I think the distinction I would say, I'll give you an answer to that in just 1 second. I think there's a distinction between the day it all ended, or to take a concession point from Adam, like the day we realized it all ended. Because maybe, as Adam says, it was never all that good, but there was a patina that it's free and open. And I would say something like WikiLeaks would certainly give Adam's argument that it was never all that free and open anyway. Stuff was going on from the very beginning that was really not about free and openness, but about control, about surveillance, about echelon, whatever other technology you want to look at, that this illusion of free and openness certainly came to an end then, if it ever really existed. Certainly the ability to say, we live in a Barlovian world, that was shattered for everybody, I think, when WikiLeaks revealed the extent to which Edward Snowden's kind of look behind the curtain, as it were. So I think that would be a day you could say nobody could live in that naive world to say that it certainly was a paradise. Again, I think Adam and I, or certainly I am trying to adopt a point here for the sake of argument, but I think the notion of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. There is, however we look at safety or security, I don't think we should leave the notion of freedom of expression out of the mix. The freedom of the ability for people to, use the internet for ways that are not just sanctioned and okay, but for creative and perhaps disruptive ways. And again, in society too, that means we have to allow the fact that yes, there can be fraudsters, there can be scammers, there can be criminals, there can be spies, but we have laws and ways of dealing with that without necessarily making everybody kind of, check in every day and having Big Brother telescreens on our walls. I mean, I think somewhere in the middle of that is where we'd like to be, and careful not to slide into a Big Brother approach just for running away from the problem of, some people are harmed on the internet. I think we have to be careful about striking some kind of balance there. And I think that's where this becomes less about a technology and more about political philosophy or a public policy debate of, it's not so much what are the technical ways this could be regulated, but what are the principles with which you would like to regulate things? And again, it comes down to a lot of questions that Adam said. Who are you talking about? Are you talking about maximizing individual freedom, or are you talking about maximizing the proper functioning of the bits and pieces of society that need to be allowed to function without interference, like stoplights or whatever. And I'll give you an example. We can easily get taken down the road of too much cybersecurity or a focus on too much cybersecurity and losing track of the fact that it's not only the digital realm where those kinds of things happen. Look at the opening ceremonies to the Paris Olympics. There was an awful lot of cybersecurity that went into keeping the networks up, making sure that the mobile network and everything else was not hacked. And indeed it wasn't, but somebody with a cigarette lighter burnt 5G towers down and took the network offline. So looking at this solely through the eye of a technical solution, as you say, what's the best technical way of regulating this? Or is there a magic device that can do it for us or a magic algorithm? I think loses sight of the fact that this is actually not as independent of other aspects of society. So the principles that we have, the ideals that we would like to have are not necessarily different, or you'd have to make a case for why they should be different in those spaces. And I think this creeping overreach by both platforms having this proprietary norm and perhaps states having a security norm have a tendency, as we've seen in other aspects of life, of taking over. And where is that pushback going to come from? If those pushbacks are now going to be silenced because, oh, you must be weak on China because you don't want to have restrictions on TikTok, I think that's an unhelpful kind of aspect.
Adam.
So, I mean, I think it depends on what we're talking about regulating. So just to move through a whole range of issues, I think we should have a national data privacy protection law. I mean, the fact that we don't creates a lot of vulnerabilities and securities that are exploited by both the companies and other countries. And the fact that we might have a patchwork of different states having it, not a great outcome there. I think stuff on content moderation is extremely hard to do, especially given First Amendment concerns. But I think some of the work that was being done about transparency and access to data from outside security researchers so that they can map types of behavior, as well as the idea for what I guess is called midware or middleware. So, giving people more tools to be able to block trolls or, prevent harassment online. It's a kind of a technological solution, not necessarily a regulatory solution. On the national security side, I think there's a lot more to be done around standards for critical infrastructure. Clearly market incentives are not enough in some places. And so, the Biden administration relied a lot on executive orders, but that only went so far. There were some authorities that had to be expanded for some of the other areas that they moved on. Transparency on software supply chains, so what you're getting. So I do think there's lots of regulations around those spaces that would be useful and helpful.
Hey, Emily, do we have any questions online?
Questions in chat. I know a few people are headed out for their commute, but
Just digital tumbleweed
Yeah.
at this stage. Okay, please, yes.
Yes, York Roads. How do we think of, because this term didn't come up in the entire conversation, social media. Social media is clearly the tool of geopolitical destabilization in the world. And as consumers, since the days of AOL, that veneer has been the veneer that populace sees, not the actual internet infrastructure. And I think that's an important lens that I would love to hear your opinion on.
I mean, again, I think it's about balance. My point being, I think if we're going to say, hey, listen, social media can be exploited by Russian troll farms that are arm's length extensions of the foreign policy goals of the Russian government, or TikTok might have cute dances and pets, but it also is a tool of indoctrination by the CCP. There's a real tendency to over-egg that pudding. And the name, banning books is generally not seen as a constructive way of managing harmful issues in regular society. And yet we seem to lean more into that on the notion of content moderation and or banning entire platforms because of the potential for that harm. So I think we have to be careful that we don't start a narrative that says, shut everything down, only allow it to come from approved sources, because we will suffer because of that. Yes, there are criminal activities that take place, but we look at murder, we don't like murder, we have laws against it, but we don't restrict people's movements and say no one's allowed after 6 o'clock because that's when most murders happen, right? There are ways in which we deal with this, but I find that often the conversation when we get involved in the tech space, whether it's social media or not, somehow jumps to, well, we could do this or we could do that without really talking about what principles are at play here. The political, the philosophical, the social, the cultural. We get very focused in what's possible here. What could we do to AI content moderation or outsourcing into third parties, which are all possible solutions. But what's really the principles that are working behind that? Again, keeping a museum safe is a lot different than keeping, for example, Fort Knox safe, right? Nobody needs to go in there. We can easily keep Fort Knox safe. There are no visitors within 100 meters or whatever. Keeping a football game safe or a museum safe, you have to let people kind of come in and move around. And that's part of the challenge. It's security within a genre or a context that actually allows for the thing that you're trying to keep safe, not just batten everything down, turn everything up to 11 and say, great, we won't have any more insults happening on this platform. That's true, but we won't have anything else happening on this platform either. And I think that's really the plea that has to be done here, is that if we're not careful, the watch out, there's a spy behind every tweet, or be careful, there's a sex criminal behind every single meme, we will easily shut down any value on social media. And whether it's kitten videos or recipes or anything else, how much of that bathwater will be thrown out on this name of baby.
Adam?
So I agree with Chris, especially on the foreign interference stuff. And I think Thomas Ridd and others have argued pretty persuasively that, a lot of it is overreaction and overhype from our point, which then strengthens the actors, Russian actors and others, who then can go back to their bosses and say, look what a great job we did. And then they get more money to do more operations. And so we have to be careful about overhyping that and focusing on controls. I guess one other area of concern that I'll interject that I don't have an answer to is the role that social media has played in outside of the US and developing or less stable states, and in particular thinking about the role that Facebook played in the attacks on the Rohingya in Burma and others. And so, in those places, social media clearly played a role in genocidal actions. Facebook didn't have enough moderators who could speak local languages or track what was happening. The moves that Zuckerberg is signaling is that they're pulling back on all of that for U.S. political reasons, but I still worry about the impact of that on other countries. And I don't encourage those countries to censor either, but I do think we probably have to think about what those controls are. Again, there's been work that's done that tracks language use and social media, so you can kind of predict when people are going to, perhaps engage in genocidal actions. But that's prediction, that's not prevention. And so I don't have a great answer to it, but I would put that on my list of worries too.
I would say, I was in Bangkok at the time that the Sitwe massacres were happening in Myanmar, and it was exposed pretty early on that Facebook was, involved or culpable for a lot of the abuse of that platform. But that was picked up very quickly by the Thai government, who used that excuse to crack down on student protesters, for example, who were resisting the coup government that was in place, using anti-monarchy, libel laws, et cetera, through putting pressure on places like Facebook, but also YouTube and Google. And Adam's point of protecting the people in the Rohingya in Sitwe was then used as a way of shutting down open dialogue in Bangkok. So there is no simple solution here. There is no way of guaranteeing you're going to only get the good side effects and avoid all the bad sides.
I think that's a good place to hit the brakes when we usually have our cynics would say we cop out by saying there are no simple solutions in academia, and I think that's a very effective place. Plus, as well, we're just out of time. I always try and warn my students, Adam. Remember, we're not saving the world in a 3,000-word essay, and I don't think we can save the free and open internet in 45 minutes. But I hope we can all agree it's been a very good conversation. And with that, I'd just like to invite everyone to show our appreciation for our guests before we start shutting down the Zoom.
Thanks very much, Adam. It was great crossing swords with you.
My
Chris, any-
pleasure. Have
any-
a drink. Have a drink for me at the reception.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. Any closing remarks?
No, thanks very much for those who joined online. We're going to close the online segment here, and we haven't come up with the technology yet to share drinks over the airwaves. So thank you very much for those that need to go to class. This will be recorded and put on the cyber program Brightspace page in a couple of days. So thanks very much again, and happy birthday, Cyber.
Yeah.